My son sold my house while I was signing what I thought were medical papers, I said quietly, staring at the thin stack of documents resting on my lap. The ink already dry, the damage already done, and somehow, I had smiled through it all as if nothing inside me had just collapsed. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, the kind of scent designed to make places like this feel less like what they really were. A nursing home. My new home, apparently. At 68 years old, after 4 decades in the same 2-story house on Maple Ridge Drive, I was now sitting in a narrow bed with metal rails, a small dresser that wasn't mine, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot instead of the oak tree my husband and I planted the year our son was born. Daniel stood near the door, his car keys spinning slowly around his finger, a habit he'd had since he was a teenager, something I used to find endearing. Now it felt like a countdown I hadn't agreed to. "It's just temporary, Mom," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, his voice smooth in that practiced way he used in business meetings, the same tone he used when he wanted people to accept something without asking too many questions. Ashley stood beside him, her arms folded loosely, her posture relaxed, almost bored, as if we were waiting for a table at a restaurant instead of finalizing where I would spend the rest of my days. Her heels clicked once against the tile floor as she shifted her weight, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You'll have people here your age," she added, her smile polite, perfectly measured, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Activities. Care. It's better for you. Better for me." I let those words settle in the silence between us, heavy and hollow. I had heard them before, in different forms, over the past few months. When Ashley insisted on helping me organize my finances. When Daniel suggested consolidating accounts to make things easier. When a stack of papers appeared one afternoon, placed neatly on my kitchen table while the sunlight streamed through the curtains I had sewn myself 20 years ago. "Just routine updates, Mom," Daniel had said then, tapping the top page lightly. "Insurance adjustments. Healthcare stuff. Nothing complicated." I remembered the way Ashley had stood just behind him, close enough to see every line I read, every place I signed, her presence calm but watchful. I remembered how I had trusted them, because that's what mothers do, because I had spent a lifetime believing that everything I built was for him, for my son, for his future. The house wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was where Daniel took his first steps across the living room floor, where he measured his height against the pantry door frame year after year, where I stayed up late sewing Halloween costumes and baking birthday cakes, where I sat beside my husband during his final weeks, holding his hand as the world we built together slowly grew quieter. And now, without a single honest conversation, without a moment of real acknowledgement, it was gone. Sold. Not because I couldn't maintain it. Not because I wanted to leave. But because it was valuable. Because it could be turned into something else. Something more useful to them. I glanced down at my hands, at the faint ink smudge near my thumb where I had signed my name over and over again without reading closely enough. Without questioning why there were so many pages for something so routine. "When can I go home?" I asked, my voice steady, softer than I expected. Daniel hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. I saw it. The flicker of discomfort. The quick glance toward Ashley. The silent conversation passing between them without words. "Mom," he began, clearing his throat. "The house, it's already been sold." There it was. Simple. Final. As if he were talking about an old car, or a piece of furniture we no longer needed. I nodded slowly, as though I were processing it for the first time, as though this was news instead of confirmation. Inside, something colder than anger settled into place. Not shock, not grief. Something sharper. Something that didn't rush or break, but waited. "Oh," I said, folding my hands neatly in my lap, the same way I used to when listening to Daniel explain his school projects as a child. "I see." Ashley exhaled, almost imperceptibly, as if relieved that I wasn't going to make this difficult. Daniel relaxed his shoulders, the tension slipping away now that the truth had been spoken out loud. They thought this was the end of the conversation. They thought this was the moment I would accept it, quietly, the way I always had when it came to him. I looked up at them, offering a small, gentle smile, the kind that had comforted him through scraped knees and broken hearts years ago. "You've done so much for me," I said, my voice calm, even warm. "I'm sure you had your reasons." And that was when they made their first mistake. Because they believed me. The first night passed without sleep, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because the silence felt unfamiliar, too clean, too controlled, as if even my thoughts were expected to behave within these walls. Back home, the house had its own rhythm, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft creak of the staircase when the temperature dropped at night, the wind brushing against the oak tree outside my bedroom window. Here, there was only the distant echo of a television down the hall and the occasional roll of a cart across polished floors. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying the past few months with a clarity that had been missing before, as if something inside me had finally shifted into focus. It had not started with the papers. It had started long before that, in the small changes I chose not to question. Daniel calling less often, his visits becoming shorter, always accompanied by Ashley, who gradually began answering questions that were never directed at her. The way she would gently interrupt, finishing his sentences, steering conversations toward practical matters, finances, maintenance, things that suddenly seemed urgent in a house that had stood solid for decades. I remembered one afternoon in early spring when she suggested I should not worry about paying bills on my own anymore. She said it with concern, her tone soft, almost affectionate, as if she were offering relief rather than taking control. Daniel had nodded beside her, grateful, even proud of the solution. I had agreed because it felt easier, because I trusted him, because I believed that letting my son help me was a natural step, not a warning sign. After that, things moved quietly. Statements stopped arriving in the mail. Ashley said she had set everything to digital to keep things organized. She showed me a few screens on her tablet, numbers and charts that I barely had time to process before she moved on to the next topic. I told myself I did not need to understand every detail. I told myself that was what family was for. A week later, she brought over a folder with neatly arranged documents, placing it on my kitchen table with a reassuring smile. Daniel poured coffee while she explained that these were standard updates, adjustments to insurance, permissions for medical decisions, small things that would make life smoother if anything ever happened. I remember holding the pen, hesitating for a brief moment, not out of suspicion, but because of the sheer number of pages. Ashley had leaned slightly closer then, pointing to the signature lines, her voice calm and patient, guiding me through each one. Daniel had stayed quiet, watching, occasionally adding that it was all routine, that everyone did this eventually. I signed where they indicated, trusting the rhythm they created, trusting the familiarity of my own name written again and again. Looking back now, I could see the precision in it, the careful layering of small decisions that led to one irreversible outcome. It was never rushed. It was never forced. It was presented as care, as responsibility, as love. That was what made it so effective. I turned my head toward the narrow window beside the bed, watching the faint glow of the parking lot lights bleed into the darkness. Somewhere beyond that, far past the rows of identical buildings and quiet streets, stood the house I had built my life around, now belonging to someone else who would never know the stories held within its walls. And then there was the trip. I had not known about it at first. It was not mentioned in conversation, not even hinted at in passing. I discovered it the same way people discover things they were never meant to see, by accident, in a moment that felt insignificant at the time. A week before I came here, Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he stepped outside to take a call. The screen lit up with a notification, a message preview that caught my attention without me trying to look. Ashley had written something about finalizing reservations, about confirming flights, and a hotel overlooking the water. I did not touch the phone. I did not read further. I simply stood there, letting the meaning settle slowly, piece by piece, until it connected with everything else that had been happening around me. Later that evening, I asked Daniel if they had any travel plans coming up, keeping my tone light, casual, the way I always did when I did not want to seem intrusive. He smiled a little too quickly and said they were thinking about taking a short trip, nothing extravagant, just a break after a busy year. I nodded, accepting the answer as if it were complete, as if it matched what I had seen. That was the moment I understood something I had not been willing to admit before. This was not about my well-being. It was not about making things easier for me. It was about something else entirely, something planned, something calculated, something that required me to be out of the way. I closed my eyes, breathing slowly, letting the realization settle into something steady and controlled. They believed I had been guided here by necessity. They believed I had accepted it out of trust. And for now, I would let them believe that. I learned quickly that places like this run on routines, quiet schedules designed to make days blend together until time feels less like something you live through and more like something that simply passes over you, unnoticed and unchallenged. And for most people here, that seemed to be enough. But I was not most people, and I had not lived my life by letting things happen without understanding why. On the second morning, a nurse named Carol brought me breakfast on a small plastic tray, oatmeal, toast, and a cup of coffee that tasted thinner than what I used to make at home, and she spoke to me with a kindness that felt genuine, not practiced, asking if I had settled in, if I needed anything, if my son would be visiting later. I smiled and told her I was still getting used to everything, keeping my answers simple, measured, the same way I had done the day before, because there was no advantage in revealing more than necessary, not yet. After she left, I sat by the window and watched the parking lot slowly fill with cars, staff arriving for their shifts, visitors coming and going, people moving through their lives with purpose while I remained still, observing, thinking, piecing things together in a way I had not allowed myself to do before. It was not just the house or the papers or even the trip that mattered. It was the sequence, the timing, the careful coordination that made everything fall into place so neatly, too neatly to be accidental. By late morning, I asked at the front desk if there was a way for me to review my admission paperwork, framing it as confusion about a few details, nothing urgent, just wanting to understand what I had agreed to. The receptionist hesitated for a moment before handing me a copy, her smile polite but slightly guarded, as if she was not used to residents asking questions beyond the basics. I thanked her and returned to my room, closing the door gently behind me before sitting down at the small desk and opening the folder. The documents were organized, professional, everything in order, signatures where they should be, dates aligned, authorizations clearly stated, and there, in neat legal language, was the confirmation that I had voluntarily agreed to reside here under long-term care arrangements, with financial responsibility transferred to an account that I no longer controlled. I traced my name on the page with my finger, recognizing the handwriting instantly, steady, familiar, unmistakably mine, and yet it felt distant, as if it belonged to a version of me that had been guided, directed, managed without realizing the full extent of what was being done. I turned the page slowly, reading each line with deliberate care, noting details I would have overlooked before, the dates that overlapped with the week Ashley brought those papers to my house, the authorization clauses that extended far beyond medical decisions, the sections that referenced property management and asset liquidation in language that was precise enough to protect whoever had arranged it, but vague enough that I had not questioned it at the time. I closed the folder and sat back, letting the weight of it settle, not as shock, but as confirmation of what I already knew. They had not rushed because they did not need to. They had not hidden because they had disguised everything as concern. And most importantly, they believed I would not look closely enough to see what had really happened. That belief was their second mistake. In the early afternoon, I made a call using the landline beside the bed, dialing a number I had not used in years but still remembered without hesitation. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, older now, but still steady, still sharp. Thomas Reed speaking. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, grounding myself in the sound of someone who had known me long before any of this had begun. Thomas, this is Margaret Collins, I said calmly, my voice even, controlled, as if I were calling about something ordinary, something routine. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a shift in tone, recognition settling in. Margaret, it has been a long time, he said. How can I help you? I looked down at the folder in front of me, at the signatures, the dates, the carefully constructed framework that had moved me from my home to this room without resistance. I believe, I replied slowly, that I may have signed something I was not meant to fully understand. Silence followed, not confusion, but attention, the kind that comes from someone who knows exactly what that statement implies. Tell me everything, he said. And for the first time since I arrived here, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, because now, finally, the conversation had begun. Thomas did not interrupt as I spoke, not once, not even when the details became clearer, sharper, more deliberate with every sentence I laid out. And that was how I knew he understood the gravity of what I was describing, not as a misunderstanding, not as a family disagreement, but as something structured, something that had been put into motion with intent. I told him about the documents, about the timing, about the way control had shifted piece by piece until there was nothing left in my hands. And when I finished, there was a brief silence on the line, not empty, but measured, the kind of silence that comes before someone begins to think strategically. "Margaret," he said finally, his tone steady, precise, "do you have copies of anything you signed before this admission?" I looked at the folder again, at the clean, organized pages that told only part of the story. "No," I replied truthfully. "But I remember when they were brought to me, and I remember who was there." Another pause, shorter this time. "That may be enough," he said. "But we need more. Timing, witnesses, anything that establishes context." Context. The words settled in my mind with unexpected weight, because context was exactly what had been removed from everything I signed, stripped away until all that remained were isolated agreements that looked reasonable on their own, but together formed something entirely different. "They told me it was for insurance and healthcare," I said slowly. "Routine adjustments. And you trusted them." Thomas replied, not as a question, but as a fact. "Yes," I answered just as calmly. There was no need to deny it now. "Good," he said, and there was something almost approving in his voice that I had not expected. "That means we can show reliance. That matters." I leaned back in the chair, letting his words settle, understanding that this was no longer about what had been done, but about how it could be proven. "What about the house?" I asked. "It is already sold." "Not necessarily final," Thomas said. "Transactions can be challenged, especially if there is evidence that consent was not fully informed or was obtained under misleading circumstances." Misleading circumstances. The phrase echoed quietly, precise in a way that matched everything I had experienced but had not yet named. "I will need to review everything," he continued. "The admission agreement, any transfer documents, financial records if we can access them. Do you know where your accounts were held?" I hesitated. For a moment, not because I did not know, but because I was realizing how little control I had left over them. "They moved everything," I said. "Ashley handled most of it." There was a slight shift on the other end of the line, not surprise, but recognition. "Then we start there," he replied. "Do not confront them. Do not question them directly. Let them believe everything is settled." I almost smiled at that, because it aligned perfectly with what I had already decided. "I understand," I said. "Good," he answered. "I will come see you tomorrow. Bring whatever documents you have. And Margaret," he added, his tone softening just slightly, "do not underestimate yourself. People who plan like this often forget one thing." "What is that?" I asked. "They assume the person they are taking from will remain the same person they have always known." The call ended shortly after, but his words stayed with me, settling into place with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar after days of quiet observation. I placed the receiver back on the cradle and sat there for a moment, looking around the room again, but this time it felt different. The walls had not changed, the narrow bed was still there, the faint hum of the building still lingered in the background, but the sense of confinement had shifted into something else, something more controlled, more deliberate. This was no longer where I had been placed. It was where I would begin. In the late afternoon, Daniel called, his name appearing on the small screen of the phone beside the bed, and I answered on the second ring, keeping my tone warm, steady, exactly as he expected. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that same practiced ease, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if I had simply moved into a new apartment rather than been removed from my life without warning. "How are you settling in?" I glanced around the room, letting just enough time pass to make my answer feel thoughtful. "It is quiet," I said. "Different, but I suppose I will get used to it." "That is good," he replied quickly, relief slipping into his voice. "They will take good care of you there." "I am sure they will," I said, and I meant it though not in the way he assumed. There was a brief pause, the kind that usually led to something more, but instead, he filled it with something casual. "Ashley and I are going out of town for a few days," he said. "Just a short trip. We might not have the best reception." I let the information settle without reacting, as if it were new, as if I had not already seen the outline of it forming weeks ago. "That sounds nice," I said gently. You both work very hard. You deserve a break. Thanks, Mom, he said, and I could hear the ease return fully now, the confidence that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. We will check in when we can. Of course, I replied. When the call ended, I set the phone down carefully and folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had done earlier, the same way I had done when I first arrived, but now the gesture meant something entirely different. They believed distance would make this easier, that time and silence would settle everything into place, that by the time they returned, there would be nothing left to question. I looked at the folder on the desk, at the neat, orderly pages that had once represented control slipping away and now represented something else entirely. Evidence. And tomorrow, that would begin to matter. Thomas arrived just after 10 the next morning, dressed the same way I remembered from years ago, simple, precise, nothing unnecessary, and when he stepped into the room, he did not waste time with small talk or sympathy, which I appreciated more than anything else, because what I needed was clarity, not comfort. He closed the door behind him, placed his leather folder on the small desk, and looked around the room once before focusing entirely on me. "Show me everything," he said, and I handed him the documents without hesitation, watching as he sat down and began to read, slowly at first, then with increasing focus, his expression tightening in subtle ways that only someone paying close attention would notice. I remained quiet, letting him work, understanding that the details mattered more than anything I could say in that moment. After several minutes, he set the papers down carefully, aligning them with a precision that matched his thinking. They were thorough, he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, something sharper than before, but not careful enough. I felt something shift at those words, not relief, not yet, but recognition that what had been done was not as final as it appeared. "What do you mean?" I asked. He tapped one of the pages lightly. "This section," he said, pointing to a paragraph buried in legal language, "authorizes asset management under the assumption of diminished capacity. It allows a designated party to act on your behalf if you are unable to manage your affairs independently." I frowned slightly. "They never said anything about that." "Of course they did not," he replied evenly. "Because if they had, you would have asked questions." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "The issue is not that you signed these documents. The issue is whether you understood the full scope of what you were signing at the time." I thought back to that afternoon, to the coffee on the table, to Ashley's steady guidance, to Daniel's quiet reassurances, and I shook my head slowly. "I did not," I said. Thomas nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. "Then we have a foundation," he said. "But we need more than that. We need to show a pattern, not just a moment." He asked me to walk him through everything again, from the first time Ashley suggested helping with my finances to the day I arrived here. And this time, as I spoke, I noticed details I had not fully acknowledged before, the way Ashley always controlled the flow of information, the way Daniel deferred to her even in matters that had nothing to do with her, the way decisions were presented as if they had already been made. Thomas listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, noting timelines, identifying connections I had felt but never fully articulated. "And the sale of the house," he said finally. "Did you sign anything specifically related to that?" I hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There were documents," I said. "They said it was part of updating ownership records. Something about simplifying things." Thomas exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in understanding. "That would be the transfer," he said. "They likely structured it as a voluntary transaction supported by the authority granted in these documents." He paused, then looked directly at me. "But here is what they did not account for." I held his gaze, waiting. "Intent," he said. "If we can demonstrate that you were misled about the nature of those documents, that the explanation you were given did not match their actual effect, then the entire sequence becomes questionable." The room felt different again, not smaller, but more focused, as if every piece was beginning to fall into place with a purpose I could finally see. "What do we do?" I asked. Thomas reached into his folder and pulled out a notepad, writing something down before sliding it toward me. It was a list, simple, direct. "We start gathering evidence," he said. "Dates, conversations, any messages you might remember. We request records. We slow everything down." I looked at the list, then back at him. "And them?" I asked quietly. He considered that for a moment. We let them continue, he said. We do not alert them. People who believe they are safe tend to reveal more than they should. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, because I had already seen it in the way Daniel spoke, in the ease that returned to his voice once he believed I had accepted everything. Thomas stood, collecting the documents and placing them back in order. I will begin the formal process this afternoon, he said. There will be notices, requests for documentation, things that will make them uncomfortable, but not immediately aware of why. He paused at the door, then looked back at me. Margaret, he said, this is not over. Not even close. After he left, I sat in the same chair, the list still in front of me, the room quiet once again, but no longer empty. I picked up the pen from the desk and began writing, slowly at first, then with more certainty, recalling conversations, dates, small details that once seemed unimportant but now carried weight. The afternoon light shifted across the floor as time passed, and for the first time since I arrived, I was not watching it out of habit, but measuring it, using it. They believed I had been moved out of the way, that the chapter of my life tied to that house had been closed neatly, efficiently, without resistance. But they had misunderstood something fundamental. I was not the kind of person who disappears quietly. I was the kind who pays attention. And now, finally, I was paying attention to everything. The next few days unfolded exactly as Thomas had predicted, slow on the surface, almost uneventful to anyone who was not looking closely. But beneath that calm, small shifts began to take place, quiet movements that would not be noticed immediately, not until they started to matter. I kept my routines simple, predictable, attending the scheduled meals, sitting in the common room when expected, speaking politely with the staff, answering questions without offering anything more than necessary, and every time someone asked how I was adjusting, I gave the same answer, gentle, composed, entirely believable. I am settling in, I would say, and each time I said it, I could almost feel the illusion strengthening around me, the version of events that Daniel and Ashley believed had already been accepted. That illusion was important. It gave them space to relax, to continue as they had been, without suspicion. In the mornings, I wrote. Not letters, not anything formal, just notes, carefully reconstructing the timeline Thomas needed, anchoring each memory to something specific, a date, a season, a detail that could not be easily dismissed. The afternoon Ashley brought the first folder of documents. I remembered the sunlight hitting the edge of the kitchen table, the faint smell of coffee cooling in the mug beside me. The week Daniel insisted on changing my account access, I recalled the exact phrase he used. It is just more secure this way, Mom. Each detail mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Precision builds truth in ways emotion cannot. On the third day, Thomas called to update me, his voice steady, focused, already moving several steps ahead. We have submitted formal requests for transaction records, he said. Bank transfers, property filings, anything tied to your name. Within the last 6 months. I listened quietly, absorbing the weight of that. Will they be notified? I asked. Eventually, he replied. But not yet in a way that reveals everything. For now, it will appear procedural. Procedural. Another word that carried quiet power, because it meant the process had begun, whether Daniel and Ashley understood it or not. That afternoon, I received a message from Daniel, short, casual, as if sent between activities. He told me they had arrived safely, that the weather was beautiful, that the view from their hotel overlooked the ocean. There was a photo attached, a wide stretch of blue water under a clear sky, sunlight reflecting across the surface in a way that was almost blinding. I studied the image for a moment before setting the phone down, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that felt sharper than anything else. This was what my house had become to them. A view, a moment, a transaction that funded something temporary, something that would fade as quickly as the photograph itself. I replied simply, wishing them a good trip, telling them to enjoy their time, and I meant every word, not because I approved, but because their comfort served a purpose now. The more at ease they felt, the less careful they would be. That evening, I sat by the window again, watching the lights shift across the parking lot as the day settled into night, and I thought about the woman I had been just a few weeks ago, the one who trusted easily, who accepted explanations without questioning their depth, who believed that love, once given, remained unchanged. That woman was still part of me, but she was no longer the one in control. Something else had taken her place, something quieter, more deliberate, something that did not react immediately, but waited, observed, and chose its moment carefully. On the fourth day, Thomas visited again, this time with more information, more structure, more pieces beginning to align. He explained that the property transaction had been filed quickly, almost too quickly, finalized within a narrow window that suggested urgency rather than necessity. He pointed out inconsistencies in the documentation, small details that, on their own, might have gone unnoticed, but together created a pattern that could not be ignored. They moved fast because they believed they had complete authority, he said. And that confidence is where they made their mistake. I listened, nodding slowly, understanding that this was no longer about uncovering what had happened, but about proving it in a way that could not be dismissed. What about the funds? I asked. We are tracking them, he replied. And if they have been used in ways that connect directly to the transaction, that strengthens everything. I thought again of the photograph, of the ocean view, of the quiet message that accompanied it, and I said nothing because I did not need to. Thomas could already see it forming, just as I could. After he left, I returned to my notes, adding new details, refining timelines, making sure that every piece fit exactly where it needed to be. The days continued like this, calm, controlled, outwardly unchanged, but beneath that surface, something was building, something steady and irreversible. They believed distance would protect them, that time would smooth everything over, that by the time they returned, nothing would remain but acceptance. But what they did not understand was that distance had given me something they had not expected. Time to see clearly, time to remember, time to prepare. And when they came back, they would not be stepping into the same story they had left behind. They returned sooner than I expected, not in person, but in presence, the kind that announces itself through small shifts, subtle changes that most people would overlook, but that I had learned to recognize with careful attention. It began with a message from Daniel, longer this time, more detailed, describing their trip in a way that felt almost rehearsed, as if he were trying to maintain a sense of normalcy that no longer existed. He mentioned the restaurants, the view, the weather, each detail placed neatly into sentences that carried a tone of ease. But beneath it, there was something else, something slightly strained, as if he were speaking into a space he could no longer fully control. I responded the same way I had before, calmly, warmly, asking just enough questions to keep the conversation moving without revealing anything beyond what he expected from me. That balance was important. Too little interest would raise suspicion. Too much would invite scrutiny. What I needed was consistency, the version of myself they believed they understood. Later that afternoon, Thomas called again, his voice carrying a quiet sense of momentum. We have movement, he said, without preamble. I sat by the window, watching a car pull slowly into the parking lot as I listened. What kind of movement? I asked. The financial records, he replied. Funds from the property transaction were transferred through an intermediary account before being used for multiple expenditures. Travel is one of them. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in surprise, but in confirmation. It connects, I said quietly. Yes, he answered. And more importantly, it establishes intent. This was not about long-term care planning. It was about access. Access. The words settled with precision, because that was exactly what had been taken, not just my house, but my ability to decide, to manage, to remain in control of my own life. What happens next? I asked. We continue, he said. We allow them to proceed as if nothing has changed. At the same time, we begin formal challenges to the transaction and the authority under which it was executed. I nodded slowly, even though he could not see it. And when they find out? I asked. There was a brief pause. They will, he said, but not all at once. It will start with questions, requests for clarification, notices that require responses. I understood what he meant. It would not be a single moment of realization, but a series of small disruptions, each one chipping away at the certainty they believed they had secured. That evening, Daniel called again, this time with Ashley on the line as well, her voice bright, controlled, carrying that same polished tone she had always used when presenting something as reasonable, something that could not easily be challenged. We were just thinking about you, she said, her words smooth, deliberate. How are you doing today? I leaned back slightly, letting the question settle before answering. I am well, I said. The staff here is very attentive. That is wonderful, she replied quickly. We just want to make sure you are comfortable. I could hear the faint sound of something in the background, music perhaps, or the distant murmur of a crowded place, a reminder of where they were, of what they were doing with the life they believed they had secured for themselves. We will come visit as soon as we get back, Daniel added, his tone reassuring, almost eager, as if the promise itself was enough to maintain the illusion of connection. Take your time, I said gently. Enjoy your trip. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest something unspoken, something neither of them addressed directly. Then Ashley spoke again, her voice slightly softer now. You are sure everything is all right? She asked. I smiled. Even though they could not see it, the expression calm, measured, exactly as it needed to be. Everything is exactly as it should be, I replied. And that was the truth, just not in the way they believed. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat in silence for a moment, letting the conversation replay in my mind, not for what was said, but for what was implied, for the spaces between their words where certainty had begun to shift into something less stable. They were still confident, still composed, but there was a trace of something else now, something they had not intended to reveal. Awareness, not of what I was doing, not yet, but of the possibility that not everything was as settled as they had assumed. The next morning, a letter arrived for me at the front desk, forwarded from Thomas's office, sealed, official, the kind of document that does not ask questions, but requires answers. I held it for a moment before opening it, understanding that this was the point where everything began to move beyond quiet observation and into something tangible, something that would reach them whether they were ready or not. Inside was a copy of the initial filing, formal, precise, outlining the basis for challenging the transactions that had been executed in my name. I read it carefully, line by line, recognizing the structure of it, the way each detail I had provided had been translated into language that carried weight, that demanded attention. When I finished, I folded the document neatly and placed it back into the envelope, my hands steady, my thoughts clear. They believed they had already reached the end of this story, that everything important had already happened. But they had misunderstood something essential. The moment they thought was the conclusion was only the beginning, and now, step by step, that beginning was starting to take shape in ways they could no longer ignore. The call came in the late afternoon, not from Daniel, not from Ashley, but from a number I did not recognize, and for a brief moment, I simply let it ring, watching the screen light up and dim again before answering, already knowing, in a quiet way, that something had shifted. Margaret Collins, a voice asked, professional, measured, the kind that carries formality even in simple words. Yes, I replied calmly. This is Elaine Porter from Westbrook Title Services. I am calling regarding a property transaction recently filed under your name. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my fingers resting lightly on the armrest, my voice steady. I see, I said. What about it? There was a pause, not hesitation, but careful wording. We have received a formal inquiry challenging the validity of the transfer, she continued. There are questions regarding authorization and informed consent. I let the words settle, not reacting, not interrupting, allowing her to continue. As part of this process, she said, we are required to verify certain details directly with you. Of course, I replied. I am happy to help. The conversation that followed was precise, structured, focused on specifics, dates, circumstances, the conditions under which I had signed the documents, and with each answer I gave, I could feel the foundation they believed was secure beginning to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that would be immediately visible, but in a way that could not be reversed once it started. When the call ended, I placed the phone down gently, my expression unchanged, but inside, there was a quiet certainty that something irreversible had just begun. They would receive similar calls. Not explanations, not accusations, but questions. Questions that required answers they had not prepared for. That evening, Daniel called again. But this time, the tone was different, the ease from before replaced with something tighter, more controlled, as if he were trying to maintain a sense of normalcy that no longer came naturally. Mom, he said, skipping the usual greeting. Have you spoken to anyone about the house? I turned my gaze toward the window, watching the fading light stretch across the parking lot. I have spoken to a few people, I said, my voice even, unhurried. There was a pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, there was an edge beneath his words. Why, he asked. Because I wanted to understand what I signed. I replied simply. Silence followed, not empty, but charged, the kind of silence that carries realization, not fully formed, but beginning to take shape. Mom, he said slowly, everything was explained to you. I allowed a small breath to pass before answering. It was presented to me, I said. That is not the same thing. I could hear movement on his end, a shift, perhaps Ashley stepping closer, perhaps a glance exchanged, silent communication passing between them just as it had before. But now, something had changed. Now, they were reacting. This is unnecessary, he continued, his voice firming slightly. Everything was done properly. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but to steady the clarity of what I already knew. Then you should have no difficulty answering their questions, I said quietly. Another pause, sharper this time, and then Ashley's voice entered, controlled, composed, but no longer as smooth as it had been before. Margaret, she said, carefully, we did what was best for you. You were overwhelmed. You needed help. I let her words settle, recognizing them for what they were, not explanation, but justification, something constructed after the fact to support decisions already made. Perhaps, I said, but that does not mean I understood everything that was done. There was a subtle shift in her tone then, something tighter, less patient. Are you saying you did not agree to the sale? She asked. I opened my eyes, looking straight ahead, my voice calm, precise. I am saying, I replied, that I was not given the full picture when I signed those documents. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, heavier, more defined, carrying the weight of something they could no longer dismiss as simple confusion. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a challenge. We will talk about this when we get back, Daniel said finally, his voice controlled, but no longer relaxed. Of course, I answered gently. I will be here. When the call ended, I remained still for a moment, letting the shift settle completely, recognizing it for what it was. The first crack. Not in the documents, not in the process, but in their certainty. They had believed everything was finished, that all decisions had already been accepted, that nothing remained but time to move forward. But now, they were being asked to look back, to explain, to justify, to defend. And that was where control began to change hands. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but step by step, question by question, until the version of events they had relied on could no longer hold together. I reached for the envelope on the desk, the one containing the formal filing Thomas had prepared, and ran my fingers lightly along its edge, not opening it again, not needing to, because I already understood what it represented. Not just evidence, not just a process, but a turning point. And from this point forward, everything they had done in quiet confidence would have to stand in the open, where nothing could be hidden behind careful words or controlled narratives. They had taken something from me without expecting resistance. Now, they were about to learn what resistance actually looked like. They came back 3 days later, not with the confidence they had left with, but with something quieter, something more cautious, and I could see at the moment they walked into the room, the way Daniel paused just slightly at the doorway, the way Ashley's eyes moved quickly across the space before settling on me, measuring, recalculating. I was sitting by the window, exactly where they expected me to be, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, as if nothing had changed, as if the past week had been nothing more than a period of adjustment. Mom, Daniel said, stepping forward, his voice controlled, careful, as though each word had been chosen in advance. We need to talk. I nodded gently, gesturing toward the chairs across from me. Of course, I replied. Please sit. They exchanged a brief glance before taking their seats, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal what they were both trying to hide. Uncertainty. It was subtle, but it was there. We have been getting calls, Ashley began, her tone composed, but no longer effortless. About the house. About the transaction. I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had done from the beginning, but now the gesture carried something different, something steady and grounded. Yes, I said. That is part of the process. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. What process? He asked. The one that reviews whether everything was done properly. I answered, my voice calm, precise. There was a flicker in his eyes then, something quick and unguarded, before he steadied himself again. Everything was done properly, he said firmly. I held his gaze, not challenging, not confrontational, simply present. Then you have nothing to worry about, I replied. The words settled between us, simple, undeniable, and for the first time, he did not respond immediately. Ashley shifted slightly in her chair, her posture still composed, but the ease was gone now, replaced by a kind of careful restraint. Margaret, she said, her voice measured, we did what was necessary. You were not in a position to manage everything on your own. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without accepting them. That may be how you saw it, I said, but it is not how it was explained to me. Daniel exhaled quietly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had not seen from him in years. Something instinctive, unplanned. This does not have to become a problem, he said. We can fix this. We can make adjustments. I watched him for a moment, recognizing the shift in language, from certainty to negotiation, from control to reaction. You already made adjustments, I said gently, without asking me. The silence that followed was heavier now, no longer uncertain, but defined, the kind that marks a line that cannot be crossed back over. Ashley straightened slightly, her expression sharpening in a way that revealed more than she intended. What exactly are you trying to do? She asked. I met her gaze, steady, unhurried. I am trying to understand what was done in my name, I replied, and to make sure it reflects what I actually agreed to. Daniel looked down briefly, then back at me, and in that moment, I saw something I had not seen before, not just concern, but realization, the slow recognition that this was no longer something he could smooth over with a few reassurances or carefully chosen words. The sale is already completed, he said. You cannot undo that. I allowed a small pause before answering, just enough to let the weight of his statement settle. That depends, I said quietly, on whether it was done with full and informed consent. The words landed with precision, not raised, not emphasized, but clear enough that neither of them could ignore what they meant. Ashley leaned back slightly, her arms crossing, her posture shifting into something more defensive now. You signed the documents, she said. Yes, I replied. I did. I let the agreement sit there for a moment before continuing. But signing something does not mean I understood what it truly authorized. Another silence followed, but this one was different, no longer filled with resistance, but with calculation, both of them trying to determine what I knew, what I could prove, how far this had already gone. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now. What do you want? He asked. I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the child I had raised, not as the man who had just returned from a trip funded by what he believed was his to take, but as someone standing at a point where choices still mattered. I want the truth to be clear, I said, not just for me, but in every document that carries my name. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, and in that small movement, something settled into place, something final, something that did not need to be spoken. They had thought this would be simple, that it would end with a signature, a transfer, a quiet departure. But what they had not understood was that control is not taken in a single moment. It is maintained, or it is lost, depending on what happens after. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse, my movements calm, deliberate, and for the first time since they arrived, I stepped past them toward the door, not as someone being moved, but as someone choosing where to go next. I believe everything will be addressed soon, I said, pausing briefly before opening the door. And when it is, we will all understand exactly what was done. I did not wait for a response. I did not need one, because the outcome was no longer something they could control. They had taken my house, believing it was the most valuable thing I had. But they had misunderstood what I was willing to protect, and more importantly, what I was capable of reclaiming. And as I walked down the quiet hallway, the sound of my footsteps steady against the polished floor, I realized something with absolute clarity. They had not just lost control of the situation. They had lost something far more important. They had lost me.